Hello everyone and welcome to ZP Productions, and today's video is going to be very focused. It is about the R3 and how does it feel like using it for portraiture. Is it a good camera for the purpose of portraiture itself? Now the R3 is just launched about 11 days ago, and in these 11 days I did 9 photo shoots. And before we start, let me show you the photos I taken with the R3. Now, I think you have seen the photos I've taken with the R3, and I can tell you is that the R3 is a really nice camera to use for portraiture itself. But there are of course some downsides to it, and in today's video, I'll share you my thoughts on the R3 as a portrait photographer's camera. Now, of course, I use the R3 for videos, for other purposes, but today's focus is just on portrait, and if you are a portrait photographer, this may be the video for you. Now, before I actually talk about the R3 itself, I will say a few things. Firstly, I do not have any brand loyalty, so I use whatever camera that best fits the purpose. So if I need more megapixels, I will use a camera with more megapixels. So megapixels is not a problem to me, at least for the purpose of most portraiture. There's only a few niche portraits that I need more than 24 megapixels, and I would take a bigger camera, or should I say take a camera with bigger megapixel count, like a GFX or maybe a A1 or A7R4 to get the job done. And next is that you do not need an expensive camera to do portraiture. I'm only sharing you my thoughts of using the R3 for the purpose of portraiture. But every time somebody will write in the comments of you don't need a $6,000 camera or you don't need 30 FPS for portrait. Yes, you don't need it. However, when you have it, when you utilize it, you will feel that it does help you in certain ways. Either it speeds things up, reduces the stamina load on the subject, or maybe just make the whole shoot more pleasant and quicker. So that's something to note. You can use any camera to do portraiture. It's just that better cameras equal to usually faster and quicker and more reliable photo shoots. That being said, let's talk about the R3 now. Now, I'll talk about a few things that I didn't like about the R3 and a few things I liked about the R3. And the things I don't like are really small, minor quibbles, I would say, minor quibbles, but they are there. And I do not want to talk about things like arrangement, settings and stuff. It's really things that cannot be rectified without certain hardware fixes. So let's first talk about the first one, and that is the cap. Notice that my cap is missing. Now, on the R3, the cap is actually important because it enables weather sealing, full weather sealing, because there is actually a multifunctional port here, and without the cap, it's not fully weather sealed. Now, why did I bring out the cap for a portrait video itself? I mean, this video is about portraits, right? Taking portraits with the R3, right? Is that the cap is a necessary thing that you have to remove if you are using flash triggers. And if you are doing portraiture, inevitably you will use flash. I mean, some of you may not use flash, some of you may be just purely available light shooters, but if you use any form of flash, there is a need to put a trigger. And when you need to put a trigger, you have to remove the cap, put the trigger on. And this is where the problem comes in, because when you remove the cap 2 times, 3 times, it becomes loose. And I lost it in one of my outdoor photo shoots that I wasn't even using flash. That photo shoot, I was just using my cameras outdoor, and it just went missing. So now my camera is not fully weather sealed. I do not know whether if rain actually touches the port, it will spoil it or not. I'm probably not going to try it. I'm going to have to hunt a new cap, but yes, the cap is missing now. The second thing is that the flip-out screen. Now, the flip-out screen is obviously a decision because it is a middle ground between photography and videography. If you want to do video, you can actually flip forward to actually do selfie, or flip at any angle to shoot certain weird-ass angles. But for the purpose of photography and portraiture, you can also use it in most awkward angles itself. Now, the thing is that the flip-out screen isn't that great for portraiture, and that's because of a few things. Firstly, it requires more actions. It requires you to have one action to flip it out, second action to turn it to wherever direction you want. The second problem is that when you flip out the screen, the EVF is disabled. So if you want to check sharpness, you want to check exposure, this screen is not exactly correct. I mean, you can use highlight alert and stuff, but if you want to check the general color, tone, and sharpness, you need to use the EVF, especially outdoors. And the only way to do it is to flip it back in. Once you flip it back in, if you want to shoot again, you have to flip it out, do the procedure all over again, which is a minor annoyance. Overall, I do prefer the flip-out screen you have in the GFX 100, or if not, the Nikon Z9, where you can flip both landscape and portraits. So I do prefer that for the purpose of photography, but I know where Canon is coming from. They are trying to have a middle ground between a photo and video-oriented camera as such, the flip-out screen. The next thing I want to talk about is that the camera with an integrated grip always will block your mouth when you are talking. Now, this is a physical aspect of the camera. And the R3 has an integrated grip, so regardless of whatever you try to do, the grip is always there and it will block your mouth. So if you are wearing a mask like me, especially outdoors because it's still mandatory in Singapore, a mask plus a grip equals to I can't communicate with my subject. So it's a problem. So the only way to communicate with the subject is I cannot look through the EVF and then tweak my subject's action and movement, which as a portrait photographer means I will lose some control over my subject. Not the greatest thing ever, but it happens. Now, those are minor annoyances. I call it minor annoyances because there are ways to work around them. You still can get your job done, but it will annoy you when when you need to repeatedly use these things, such as if you want to give instructions, it will just annoy you. When you want to shoot in certain angles, you have to flip out, flip in, flip out, flip in, it will just annoy you. And then now that the cap is lost, every time you see it, it annoys you. Yes. Now, let's talk about the great things about the R3, and the great things are kind of like the spec sheet itself. Firstly, the autofocus system. I prefer the Canon autofocus system over the autofocus system in Sony because the AF box is smaller. I mean, take a look at the link above. I talk about it when I compare the R5 and the A1. And the R3 kind of improved over the R5. Firstly, it is faster, it is quicker, it is more reliable. And it still keeps whatever the R5 has, which is a smaller AF box, a more reliable one that sticks onto the eye, have a lesser tendency to focus on the glasses and the hair. In fact, this whole shoot that I did, the subject was wearing a glass, or should I say a frame, a spectacle frame, and I never had problem with it. The R3 is more reliable than the R5, at least based on my 9 photo shoots, is less than 2% that was soft or out of focus. On the R5, it's closer to 3 to 4%. That's my own personal experience. The next I'll talk about is the 30 FPS, or should I say the very predictable 30 FPS. See, unlike other cameras, the FPS is dependent on the lens you use, the settings you do, how close, how far you are, and whatever. But on the R3, it's always 30 FPS. At least for the purpose of portraiture, I haven't tried any other way. Even if the subject is walking towards me using a 85 1.2 or Sigma 40 1.4, subject is spinning, subject is jumping, I always get my 30 FPS regardless of setting. It doesn't matter. On the A1, I have to take a conscious effort to switch between compressed, uncompressed, raw. I have to make sure I use a Sony lens. If not, it will not have 30 FPS because a Sigma lens just don't give 30 FPS for some reason. I think it's the AF, it's not quick enough or something. But yes, the R3 just gives me an overall better experience when it comes to 30 FPS. And the thing is, why is 30 FPS important for portraiture is because it reduces the stamina load on the subject. Why do I say so? Is because if you are shooting a spinning shot or a jumping shot, the lesser retries you do, the better. 30 FPS means that you will almost always get a frame that is more usable. And I would say as sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. But in the last few days, I was trying to do more flip shot, jump shots, and whatever in between. And I truly appreciate the 30 FPS because I get that little bit different that just makes it a whole lot better for portrait. And lesser retries, really lesser retries. Now, there is also one thing that makes this 30 FPS a lot usable on the R3. Firstly, is of course the buffer clears very fast. Even with SD card, it only takes 12 seconds to clear the buffer from full to empty. What it means that as long as you're not pressing it all the way for that, I think 6 seconds and then releasing it and then pressing it again, you will never have buffer overflow problems. So if you just burst, you will never see the effect. And then secondly is that there is a ability to batch delete photos. I mean, other brands may have. I remember Sony has something like that, but it requires you to activate it and go in the menu and then the batch photos will appear as a group. In the R3, it's integrated. The moment you press delete on a photo that is part of a batch photo, it will tell you that this is a batch photo and you can delete the whole batch away. So anything that's not locked will get deleted. So it's very convenient and very fast to actually scroll around the photos on the R3 and delete them accordingly if you are doing tons and tons of bursts. Now that is for 30 FPS bursts. The next thing I really like is that the eye control AF, because for me it works and it's really useful because not all the time the IAF works. So sometimes the subject detection doesn't work. So you have to manually shift the AF point around to actually get the AF point to where you want. The tracking still works, it's just the eye detection isn't working. So in this case, the eye control helps me to quickly shift my point to where I want and then continue shooting. In fact, there are a few times that I forget to on human subject detection. It was on some other mode because I was testing it and it still works flawlessly. It looks like eye control because I just look at that face, you just drop the AF onto the eye and then it tracks the eye around and around. So it's a really nice thing, and if your eyes do work for the purpose of eye control on the R3, it is a truly great perk. If not, it's just a gimmick. And then lastly, I want to talk about is that the R3 is very stable. When I say stable is that, cameras have IBs, right? You can shoot in lower shutter speeds, say 120, 115 with IBs. But that's assuming that you don't use continuous AF, and overall your camera is very stable in the hand. So the R3 is actually very stable. So when I was shooting in this particular shot here, I was shot in the tunnel and it was dark. It was 1/15 of a shutter using ISO 1600. However, the camera was so stable that I did 2 shots and one shot was text sharp and the other shot was just slightly soft. This is not possible when I was using the A1 and also not possible when I was using the R5. At least not possible when I'm using servo mode. In those cameras, if I use servo mode, it will definitely be off because somehow the AF and whatever will just mess around with it. But in this camera, it works perfectly well. As such, the R3 is probably the most stable camera I ever used, allowing me to use servo mode plus IBs, plus the lens itself, and shoot in really low light situations without changing any mode and still getting the shot I want. Very stable shot itself. So this is really all I want to share about the R3. So in the end of the day, the question is the R3 a worthy camera for portraiture? I would say both yes and no. Yes, if you are a very demanding photographer and have the money to spend. No is because if you have limited budget, I would rather you spend the money on lenses than to spend it on the R3 body. Because you could easily buy an R5 with a 85 1.2 for the price of an R3 today, or very close to it. Or you can buy an R6 with a 85 1.2 plus a 35 1.8 for the price of an R3. As such, if your budget is limited, do not get the R3 because it's just a waste of money if you are just using it for portraiture itself. Now, if you have the budget and you don't have constraint of buying whatever you want, based on my tests so far, I enjoy the R3 the most. More enjoyable than the A1 because it doesn't just get caught in that spectacle frame and the hair. More enjoyable than A1 because it's more stable. More enjoyable than A1 because the 30 FPS is more predictable, requires me less over the hoop jumping. And most importantly, the tilt screen and everything is just more usable than the A1 still. So if you ask me honestly, between this camera and the A1 for the purpose of portraiture, if megapixels is not my biggest concern, I will get the R3 every time because it's just a nicer camera to use for the purpose of portraits. Now, there's of course a Z9 out there, and the Z9 improves on the R3 a few things. Firstly, for sure, the flip screen is better. Secondly, it has higher megapixels while seems to have a very stable 20 frames per second. And then the buffer seems to be very stable. It seems to be clear very fast, unlike the A1, unless you're using the CF Express Type A. If you're using SD card, it's really slow on the A1. I do not know. Maybe when I have a hands on the Z9, my opinions may change. But at least based on all the cameras I use today, if you have the budget and you do not need more than 24 megapixels because you don't crop as much, or you're the type that just want to use whatever you capture, or you're not going to print A00 or whatever, then I would say the R3 is probably the most usable camera for the purpose of portrait today. That's my opinion. That's why for today. I hope you enjoyed this. Now, if you have anything to talk about, put in your comments below. I will answer it because There are many things to talk about for the R3 still, and I will keep it for my final review where I talk more about things like the video RAW, how it works out, various functions in the R3, what I find, other quirks that are not related to portraiture. I'll talk about it in that video there. And till then, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.